All right, welcome everyone. Today we're diving deep, really deep, into something I think we all kind of senses there, but might not always fully grasp, our inner child.
Yeah, it's one of those things that sounds a little, I don't know, touchy-feely maybe, but the more you look at it, the more you realize how profoundly it shapes us as adults.
It really does, and we're lucky to have this fantastic book as a guide for this deep dive.
Absolutely. Stephanie Stahl's The Child in You. I mean, the subtitle alone, The Breakthrough Method, kind of grabs you.
It does. So, for anyone joining us for the first time, what we do in these deep dives is really try to unpack these powerful ideas, see how they connect to our lives, and give you some tools you can actually use.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about understanding the theory. It's about, okay, now what? What do I do with this information? How can I apply it to my own life, my own relationships, my own struggles?
Exactly. So with the child at you, our mission here is to help you connect with this often hidden part of yourself, understand where a lot of your current feelings and behaviors are actually coming from, and get some practical strategies for navigating your inner world a little more skillfully.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people will be surprised by how much of what we experience as adults, those relationship patterns, those triggers that really set us off, those maybe not so helpful ways we tend to react, it can often be traced back to those early childhood experiences.
Yeah, even those experiences we don't consciously remember.
Right. That's the thing, right? It's not necessarily those big dramatic events that always shape us the most. It's often those subtle, repeated patterns of interaction, how our needs were met or not met, the emotional atmosphere of our childhood. It all gets kind of wired into our nervous system.
Okay, so let's start by really defining this inner child. What exactly are we talking about here?
So think of your inner child as this sort of sum total of all your childhood experiences, both the good and the bad. All those impressions, feelings, beliefs that got stored in your unconscious. And it's not like this little miniature version of you running around in your head.
Okay, good, because that's kind of what I was picturing.
Right. It's more like this, I don't know, this collection of emotional imprints that still influences how you see yourself, how you relate to others, how you react to the world.
So even if we don't remember those early experiences in detail, they're still kind of there, under the surface, shaping how we experience things.
Exactly. And Stahl uses this really helpful way to understand the different aspects of the inner child. She talks about the shadow child and the sun child.
I like that.
Yeah.
So tell us about the shadow child first. What's that all about?
So the shadow child is that part of us that holds on to the more difficult stuff. The fears, the insecurities, the unmet needs, the negative beliefs we developed about ourselves and the world based on those early experiences.
Right. So, for example, if you consistently felt like you had to be perfect to be loved, that might become part of your shadow child's belief system.
Exactly. Or if you were constantly criticized or never felt good enough, those feelings of inadequacy would become part of that shadow child.
And then there's the sun child.
Right. The sun child is a part of us that embodies those positive experiences, those moments where we felt loved, accepted, safe, capable. It's the part of us that holds our strengths, our creativity, our resilience.
I like that. It's like that spark of joy and wonder that we often associate with childhood.
Yeah, exactly. And ideally, as we grow up, both the shadow child and the sun child kind of integrate and become part of a healthy, balanced adult self. But often what happens is that the shadow child gets kind of stuck.
Stuck in what way?
Well, stuck in those old patterns of feeling and reacting. It's like those early wounds and fears are still running the show, even if we're not consciously aware of it. So we might find ourselves reacting in ways that don't make sense to our adult selves, or we might keep attracting the same kinds of unhealthy relationships, or we might just feel this underlying sense of anxiety or insecurity that we can't quite shake.
So it's almost like this part of us is still reacting to the world as if we were that scared or hurt child.
Exactly. And because we're not always aware of that connection, it can feel really confusing and frustrating.
It makes sense. So how does this inner child, particularly that shadow child, actually develop? What shapes it?
Well, Stahl draws on the work of developmental psychologist Klaus Grau, who identified 4 fundamental psychological needs that are essential for healthy development.
Right, I've heard those.
And how well these needs are met or not met in childhood has a huge impact on shaping our inner child, particularly those shadow child beliefs.
Okay, so let's break down those 4 needs. What are they and how do they influence us?
So the first one is the need for connection. Think about how crucial that is from the moment we're born. Babies literally need physical touch to thrive.
Right, that sense of belonging, of feeling loved and cared for.
Exactly. And as we grow, that need evolves. It becomes about feeling connected to our family, our friends, our community, having meaningful relationships where we feel seen and accepted.
Absolutely. It's such a core human need. What about the second need?
The second one is the need for autonomy and security. This is where it gets a little tricky because it's about finding that balance between independence and dependence.
Right. As kids, we need to start feeling like we can do things on our own, make our own choices, explore the world. But we also need to feel safe and secure, knowing we have a secure base to come back to.
Exactly. So if a child's need for autonomy is constantly stifled, like with overly controlling parents, they might develop this feeling of powerlessness and a lack of self-efficacy.
It's like they never learn to trust their own judgment or abilities.
Exactly. On the other hand, if there's too much freedom without enough security, like in cases of neglect, the child might feel anxious and overwhelmed, constantly on edge.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where kids feel both empowered and safe.
Precisely. And the third need is the need for pleasure.
Okay, that one sounds a bit more fun.
Right. From a very early age, we're wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. Learning how to manage those impulses is a key part of growing up.
Right, not everything can be instantly gratifying.
Exactly. And how parents handle this is really important. If they're too strict, too focused on discipline without enough joy and spontaneity, the child might develop the sense that pleasure is somehow bad or wrong.
Like they have to constantly suppress their own desires.
Right. On the other hand, if parents overindulge, always giving in to every whim, the child might not develop the resilience to cope with frustration or delay gratification.
So it's about finding that balance between allowing kids to experience joy and also helping them develop self-control.
Absolutely. And then finally, there's the need for bolstered self-esteem and acknowledgement.
This one feels really important.
It is. It's about feeling seen and valued for who you are, receiving that positive feedback and encouragement that helps you develop a strong sense of self-worth.
Right, that sense of I'm okay, I'm worthy of love and belonging.
Exactly. And parental empathy is crucial here. When parents can really tune into their child's feelings, validate them, show that they understand, it helps the child feel secure and accepted just as they are.
But if that's missing,
Then the shadow child starts to develop those negative beliefs. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy of love. I'm a burden.
it's heartbreaking to think about how much those early experiences can shape us.
It really is. But the good news is that even though these beliefs become deeply ingrained, it doesn't mean we're stuck with them forever.
Okay, good. I was going to ask about that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about how these beliefs, especially those negative shadow child beliefs, continue to affect us in adulthood.
So think of beliefs as those deep-seated convictions we hold about ourselves and the world around us. They act like these internal filters that color how we interpret everything.
Like, if you believe you're unlovable, you might interpret any little sign of rejection as confirmation of that belief.
Exactly. It's like you're constantly looking for evidence to support those pre-existing beliefs, even if they're not actually true.
So we're not always seeing things objectively.
Not always. Our shadow child can really distort our perception. Remember that example we talked about earlier with Michael and Sarah?
Oh yeah, where he had that huge reaction when she forgot his chips.
Right. Now, to an outsider, it might have seemed like a complete overreaction to something small.
It did. It was just chips, right?
But if we look at it through the lens of Michael's inner child, it starts to make more sense. Chances are Michael has some underlying shadow child beliefs about not being important, about his needs not mattering. Maybe he had experiences in childhood where he was constantly overlooked or dismissed.
So Sarah, forgetting the chips wasn't just about the chips.
Not really. It was like this symbolic trigger that activated all those old feelings of being unimportant, of not being cared for.
It's like his shadow child was saying, see, I told you, you don't matter.
Exactly. And because Michael probably wasn't consciously aware of that connection, his reaction felt out of proportion even to him.
It's fascinating how these unconscious beliefs can drive our behavior in ways that don't always make logical sense.
Absolutely. And the interesting thing is that Sarah's reaction to Michael's outburst was probably also influenced by her own inner child.
Yeah.
Maybe she's really sensitive to criticism because she grew up with a parent who is constantly finding fault.
So it becomes this kind of chain reaction.
Right. One person's shadow child triggers another person's shadow child, and before you know it, you've got a full-blown conflict that's really about something much deeper than what's happening on the surface.
It makes you realize how important it is to just become aware of those patterns.
It really is. And that's where Stahl talks about the importance of understanding the belief, interpretation, feeling, behavior cycle.
Okay, break that down for us.
So it starts with our underlying beliefs, which are often unconscious. These beliefs then shape how we interpret the events around us. Those interpretations then trigger certain feelings, and those feelings then drive our behavior.
So in Michael's case, the belief might be, my needs don't matter. The interpretation is, Sarah forgetting the chips means she doesn't care about me. The feeling is anger and hurt, and the behavior is lashing out.
Exactly. And the tricky part is that we're often only consciously aware of that feeling stage. We feel angry or hurt, but we don't always stop to question why we're feeling that way or what beliefs might be driving those feelings.
So the key is to become more aware of that whole chain of events.
Precisely. And that's where self-reflection comes in.
It sounds like all of this must have a huge impact on our self-esteem.
Absolutely. Those early experiences and the beliefs we develop about ourselves essentially form the emotional foundation of our self-esteem.
So it's not just about what we consciously think about ourselves, but more about this deep-seated feeling of worthiness or unworthiness.
Exactly. Stahl talks about basic trust versus basic mistrust. Basic trust is associated with the sun child. It's that sense of, I'm okay, I'm lovable, I belong.
And that comes from having our needs met consistently as children.
Right. Feeling loved, accepted, valued. When we have basic trust, we tend to feel secure in ourselves and in our relationships.
But with basic mistrust.
Basic mistrust is associated with the shadow child. It's that feeling of, I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable, I don't belong.
And that comes from having those needs consistently unmet.
Exactly. Feeling rejected, neglected, criticized. When we have basic mistrust, we tend to feel insecure and anxious. We're more easily triggered by perceived threats or rejection.
And it sounds like even if we logically know we're worthy, that shadow child can still make us feel otherwise.
Absolutely. Your inner adult, that rational thinking part of you, might know that you're intelligent, capable, and have a lot to offer.
But the shadow child might still whisper, but you're not good enough.
Exactly. And those feelings can be really powerful. So even if you've achieved success in your life, you might still struggle with self-doubt or feel like you're constantly trying to prove yourself.
So it's not always enough to just change our thoughts. We have to address those deeper emotional beliefs as well.
Precisely. And that's where the work with the inner child comes in.
Okay, so let's talk about what that work actually looks like. How do we start becoming more aware of our shadow child and start healing those old wounds?
So one of the first steps is to understand that when our shadow child feels threatened, it doesn't just sit there passively. It tries to protect itself.
Makes sense. It's like our own internal defense mechanism.
Exactly. And Stahl calls these defenses self-protection strategies. They're those patterns of behavior that we develop often unconsciously to try to avoid pain or rejection.
And I imagine these strategies might have been helpful in childhood when we were actually more vulnerable.
Right. They might have been a way to cope with a difficult family situation or to protect ourselves from getting hurt. But as adults, these same strategies can often backfire.
Okay, I'm curious to hear about some of these self-protection strategies. Can you give us some examples?
Absolutely. One really common one is perfectionism, which can also be tied to an obsession with beauty or a constant craving for recognition.
The need to always be the best, to never make a mistake.
Exactly. And the underlying belief there is often, I'm not good enough as I am. So the perfectionist is constantly trying to prove their worth, to avoid criticism or rejection.
It's like they're trying to earn love and acceptance through their achievements.
Right. And the problem is that it's a never-ending cycle because the bar keeps getting higher and higher. They never feel like they've truly done enough.
It's exhausting just thinking about it. What's another common self-protection strategy?
Another big one is people-pleasing.
Always putting others' needs before your own, trying to avoid conflict at all costs.
Well, exactly. And the belief there is often, I'm only valuable if I'm pleasing others, or I'm not allowed to have my own needs.
So they become kind of like emotional chameleons, constantly adapting to what they think others want from them.
Right. And they might become really good at sensing other people's moods and adjusting their behavior accordingly. But the problem is that they lose touch with their own authentic self in the process.
It's like they're sacrificing their own well-being to maintain peace or avoid rejection.
Exactly. And often it leads to resentment and burnout because their own needs are constantly being ignored.
So setting boundaries is probably really important for people pleasers.
It's essential. Learning to say no, to express their own needs and preferences, even if it might create some conflict.
Makes sense. What about the helper syndrome? Is that another form of self-protection?
Absolutely. People with helper syndrome tend to feel most valuable when they're taking care of others. They're drawn to people who need their help, and they often neglect their own needs in the process.
So it's like their self-worth is tied to how much they're giving to others.
Exactly. And the belief might be, I'm only lovable if I'm needed, or if I stop giving, they'll leave me.
It's a trap, though, right? Because they end up feeling depleted and resentful.
It is, and they might attract partners who take advantage of their generosity or who are never truly satisfied.
So learning to receive as well as give is important.
Absolutely. And recognizing that their worth isn't dependent on how much they're doing for others.
What about the power hungry? How does that manifest as a self-protection strategy?
So the power hungry are often driven by a deep-seated sense of powerlessness and distrust. They might have experienced betrayal or abuse in the past, so they feel like they need to be in control to protect themselves.
Like they're always trying to be one step ahead to anticipate any potential threat.
Exactly. And that can show up in different ways. It might be overt aggression, a need to dominate others, or it might be more passive-aggressive, like withholding affection or sabotaging others' efforts.
So even those seemingly subtle behaviors can be a way of asserting control.
Absolutely. And it's often unconscious. They might not even realize they're doing it. But the underlying motivation is to avoid feeling vulnerable or powerless.
Makes sense. What about control freaks in general? How does that fit in?
Control freaks are similar to the power hungry, but they might be even more driven by a fear of chaos and uncertainty. They need to have everything in order, to follow the rules, to plan everything down to the last detail.
It's like they can't relax unless everything is just so.
Exactly. And that rigidity can create a lot of tension in their relationships.
Because it's impossible to control everything, right?
Right. And trying to do so just leads to anxiety and frustration.
You also mentioned rebellious behavior, even using the word jerks. How does that function as a self-protection strategy?
So rebellious behavior, at its core, is often a reaction to feeling controlled or trapped. It's like the shadow child is saying, I won't let you tell me what to do.
It's like that knee-jerk resistance to authority.
Exactly. And it can manifest in different ways, from petty arguments to more serious acts of defiance.
So it's not always about being intentionally mean.
Not necessarily. It's more about that need to assert their own independence, even if it comes at the expense of others.
What about people who seem to want to stay in a childlike role?
So this is another strategy where the shadow child is basically saying, I'm not capable of taking care of myself. They might rely heavily on others for decision-making or emotional support.
Like they're afraid of growing up and taking on responsibility.
Exactly. And it might be because they were overprotected as children or because they witnessed adults who seemed overwhelmed by life.
So they never really develop that sense of self-efficacy.
Right. And the challenge is to gently encourage them to step into their own power, to start making their own choices and taking responsibility for their own lives.
You also mentioned flight and withdrawal. How does that show up as a self-protection strategy?
This is a strategy that's often used by people who feel overwhelmed by their emotions or by the demands of life.
Like they just shut down or check out?
Exactly. They might withdraw from relationships, avoid social situations, or numb themselves with work, TV, or substances.
So it's a way of escaping those difficult feelings.
Precisely. And the challenge is to help them learn to face those emotions, to process them in a healthy way, and to develop coping mechanisms that don't involve shutting down.
What about addiction? How does the inner child play a role there?
Addiction is often a way of trying to soothe the shadow child's pain. Substances or behaviors can provide a temporary sense of relief or escape from those difficult emotions.
Like self-medicating with drugs or alcohol.
Right. Or it might be an addiction to food, shopping, gambling, even work. Anything that provides that temporary hit of dopamine and distracts from the underlying pain.
And the problem is that it's a short-term solution that creates more problems in the long run.
Exactly. And often, the addiction itself becomes the biggest source of pain.
Finally, you mentioned narcissism as a self-protection strategy. How does that work?
So this is where the shadow child is basically saying, I'm worthless, and the ego creates this inflated sense of self to compensate.
Like a defense mechanism to protect that fragile ego.
Exactly. The narcissist might seem confident and self-assured on the surface, but underneath, there's often a deep well of insecurity.
And that insecurity drives the need for admiration and validation from others.
Right. And it can lead to a lot of interpersonal problems because the narcissist is often unable to form genuine connections.
So it's really important to be able to see past that facade and recognize the vulnerability underneath.
Absolutely. And often the narcissist themselves is unaware of those deeper insecurities.
This has been such a helpful overview of these self-protection strategies. Once we start to recognize these patterns in ourselves, what are some practical things we can do to start making positive changes?
Well, the first and most crucial step is developing self-awareness. It's about noticing those moments when your shadow child is getting triggered, when those old feelings and behaviors start to take over.
It's like hitting the pause button before we react automatically.
Exactly. And Stahl calls this early detection. The sooner you can recognize what's happening, the more choice you have in how you respond.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? What are some techniques for cultivating self-awareness?
One simple but powerful practice is to just check in with yourself throughout the day and ask, how am I feeling right now?
Just taking a moment to pause and become aware of our emotional state.
Exactly. And pay attention to your body as well. Often our bodies give us clues before we're even consciously aware of what we're feeling.
Like a tightness in our chest or a knot in our stomach.
Right. Those physical sensations can be early warning signs that something's off. And sometimes just focusing on those sensations without getting caught up in the thoughts or stories around them can actually help them dissipate.
Interesting. It's like we're giving those feelings space to move through us without getting stuck.
Exactly. Another helpful technique is what Stahl calls the feelings bridge.
Okay, what's that?
So when you notice a strong negative feeling, try to trace it back to your childhood. Ask yourself, how long have I known this feeling? And what situations in my childhood might have evoked similar feelings?
It's like we're creating a bridge between our present experience and our past experiences.
Exactly. And by making that connection, those feelings can often lose some of their power over us.
It's like we're saying, oh, this isn't about what's happening right now. This is an old wound that's getting triggered.
Right. And that recognition can create some distance between you and the feeling, which gives you more space to choose how you want to respond.
You also mentioned that men, in particular, might struggle with certain emotions. Why is that?
Well, societal conditioning plays a big role. Men are often taught to suppress emotions that are seen as weak or unmanly, like sadness or fear.
So they might be more comfortable with anger, which is seen as more acceptable.
Exactly. And that can create problems because anger is often a secondary emotion. It's like a mask for something deeper, like hurt or vulnerability.
So it's important for men to learn to recognize and express those underlying emotions as well.
Absolutely. It's about expanding their emotional range and allowing themselves to feel the full spectrum of human experience.
And it's probably important for everyone to remember that our perception isn't always objective.
Right. We all have our own biases and filters based on our past experiences. What one person perceives as a harmless comment, another person might perceive as a personal attack.
So it's about recognizing that our interpretations are subjective.
Exactly. And that's where Stahl talks about the importance of doing a reality check.
Okay, tell us about that.
So a reality check is basically a way to systematically examine a situation that triggered a strong reaction in you.
It's like taking a step back and dissecting the experience.
Exactly. And it involves asking yourself a series of questions. What was the trigger? What shadow child beliefs were activated? What interpretation did you make based on those beliefs? What feeling arose as a result? And what self-protection strategy did you use?
So it's about really understanding the whole chain of events that led to that reaction.
Right. And then once you've done that, you can start to explore alternative ways of interpreting the situation and responding in a more constructive way.
So it's not about denying our feelings, but about understanding where they're coming from and choosing a different path.
Exactly. And another key element of working with the shadow child is learning to create some distance between yourself and the problem.
Okay, how do we do that?
So instead of saying, I'm afraid, try saying, the shadow child within me is feeling afraid. It seems like a subtle shift, but it can make a big difference.
Because it's like we're acknowledging that those feelings are part of us, but they don't define us.
Exactly. And that separation allows us to access our inner adult, that part of us that can offer a more rational and compassionate perspective.
So it's like we're stepping into the role of the loving parent for our own inner child.
Precisely. And that's where Stahl talks about the importance of accepting the shadow child.
Okay, how do we do that? It seems counterintuitive to accept the parts of ourselves that we don't like.
I know, right? But the thing is, the more we try to fight or suppress those parts of ourselves, the stronger they become.
It's like pushing against a wall.
Exactly. So acceptance is about recognizing that those shadow child beliefs and feelings are a part of our history, a part of who we are. And by accepting them, we can start to heal them.
So it's not about condoning those negative behaviors, but about understanding where they're coming from and offering ourselves compassion.
Precisely. And one really powerful exercise for doing that is what Stahl calls consoling the shadow child.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell us about that.
So imagine yourself as a loving parent comforting a scared or hurt child.
Hmm.
What would you say? How would you hold them? How would you reassure them that they're safe and loved?
It's like we're offering ourselves that same kind of unconditional love and support.
Exactly. And it
Mhm.
can be really powerful because often what that shadow child needs most is just to feel seen and heard.
It's like we're finally giving ourselves what we didn't receive as children.
Right. And another really helpful technique is what Stahl calls overwriting old memories.
Okay, that one sounds interesting. How does that work?
So, our brains are pretty amazing in that they don't always distinguish between a real memory and a vividly imagined scenario.
Really? So we can actually change our memories.
Well, not literally change the events that happened, but we can change the emotional charge associated with those memories.
Okay, I'm following. So how do we do that?
So, if you have a painful memory from childhood that keeps resurfacing, you can intentionally go back to that memory in your mind and imagine a different ending.
Like rewriting the script?
Exactly. Maybe you imagine yourself as an adult stepping into that scene and protecting your younger self. Or maybe you imagine a wise and loving figure appearing and offering you comfort and support.
So we're basically creating a new, more positive experience in our minds.
Right. And by doing that repeatedly, we can weaken the emotional hold that those old memories have on us.
It's like we're giving ourselves the happy ending we didn't get in real life.
Precisely. And those positive images and feelings can then start to become part of our internal landscape.
That's really powerful. What about actively creating more positive experiences for our inner child in the present?
That's a great point. It's not just about healing the past, it's also about creating a more nurturing environment for our inner child in the present.
So what are some ways we can do that?
One exercise Stahl recommends is called Connection and Security for the Shadow Child.
Okay, tell us about that one.
So this exercise is about consciously recalling any positive bonding moments you might have had with caregivers in childhood.
Like those moments where you felt truly loved and cared for.
Exactly. And even if those moments were few and far between, try to really immerse yourself in those memories. Remember the sights, the sounds, the smells. Feel the warmth and security of that connection.
It's like we're reactivating those positive neural pathways.
Right. And if you don't have many positive memories from childhood, you can actually create imaginary, nurturing figures in your mind.
It's like giving ourselves the loving parents we always wished we had.
Exactly. And you can call upon those figures whenever you need comfort or reassurance.
It's like having our own internal support system.
Precisely. Another really powerful technique for working with the inner child is the chair dialogue.
Okay, I've heard of that one. Tell us how it works.
So you literally set up two chairs facing each other. One chair represents your adult self, and the other chair represents your shadow child.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Then you sit in the shadow child chair and allow yourself to express all those feelings and beliefs that are coming up.
It's like giving voice to that part of us that's often silenced or ignored.
Exactly. And then you switch chairs and respond from the perspective of your adult self.
So it's like having a conversation between two different parts of ourselves.
Right. And that dialogue can help us to understand the needs of our shadow child and to offer it the compassion and guidance it needs.
It's like we're finally integrating those different parts of ourselves.
Precisely. And that integration is a key part of healing.
This has been so helpful. Once we start to become more aware of our shadow child and practice these techniques, how do we actively strengthen our sun child and our inner adult?
That's a great question. It's not just about healing the wounds, it's also about cultivating those positive aspects of ourselves.
So how do we do that?
One really powerful exercise is called Discover Your Positive Beliefs.
Okay, I like that. Tell us more.
So this exercise involves creating a vivid image of your sun child in your mind. Imagine them as a symbol of your best self, your strengths, your joy, your resilience.
Like we're giving form to that inner light.
Exactly. And then spend some time reflecting on your positive beliefs about yourself and the world. What are your core values? What are your strengths? What are you grateful for?
It's like we're shifting our focus from what's wrong to what's right.
Precisely. And that shift in perspective can have a profound impact on our emotional well-being.
And you mentioned that our values play a key role here.
They do. Our values are like our inner compass, guiding us towards what's truly important to us. And when we're living in alignment with our values, it creates a sense of purpose and meaning that can be really empowering.
So if someone's struggling with self-doubt, connecting with their values can help them to feel more confident and grounded.
Absolutely. And Stahl recommends doing an exercise called Define Your Values, where you identify 2 or 3 core values that are particularly important to you.
And then how do you use those values?
So once you've identified your values, you can start to consciously align your actions with those values. For example, if one of your core values is courage, you might challenge yourself to step outside your comfort zone more often.
It's like those values become a source of strength and motivation.
Exactly. And they can.